Welcome to the Game Design Hacks. I am Dale.
And I'm Tom.
In this episode, Tom's going to do a deep dive into Hades. He's going to diagnose some of the things in Hades, see what makes it tick. And then we're going to set our first game design challenge. Cue the intro.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. Welcome to the third episode of Game Design Hacks. First, Tom, what are you playing?
Well, I've finally and mercifully finished Ni no Kuni. I ended up putting like 50 hours into it in the end, but I think those last 25 I just weren't enjoying.
That's quite a lot of labor.
But importantly, I got my money's worth.
Right, yeah.
I've been playing a hell of a lot of Hades, and man, that's a palate cleanser after Ni no Kuni. So I've got plenty to talk about today. And I've also got a demo for Blasphemous downloaded on my Switch, which I've picked out basically just because of the art style, but hopefully there's a good game behind it too.
Yeah, I don't know Blasphemous. Can you go into it, or do you not know much about it yet?
It appears to be like a, indie pixel art Castlevania type, modern interpretation, but it's got like some really cool heavy metal artwork. Like you play as like remember the Coneheads with Dan Aykroyd?
Yeah.
Yeah, like a cone head, but your cone's made out of iron. You got a sweet sword.
That's interesting. I wonder if it's anything like what you just described. Myself, I've just been going through Immortals Phoenix Rising still. I haven't had a lot of time to play games this week as I've been nearing completion on my mobile game. And so I've been fiddling around with Unity 2019.4, particularly in regards to ads and IAP, and feeling a little bit miserable about having to resort to that. But, I'm hopefully doing a very ethical implementation of that. We'll see. I'm erring on the side of, friendly stuff rather than greedy stuff there. The other one is, I'm diving into Game Boy assembly code at the moment.
Oh, wow.
For no reason. A couple of years back, I went to make a Game Boy game in C, and the Game Boy's a little constrained for most C compilers, so I've been meaning to go back and try again in assembly. I had a fair bit of success in C. I was making a Zelda-like game, and I maybe got about half an hour to 40 minutes worth of content in it, which is pretty cool, but it was definitely costing me a lot of time. Like, I think first couple of areas I was able to get in the first week, and then by the time I got the third area in, it was about 2 weeks later. And by the time I got 4 areas into the game, it was about 2 months after that because of how many constraints I was starting to hit and how many problems I was having with the compiler. And it just became very obvious to me that I needed to learn assembly if I wanted to make a Game Boy game.
I still haven't been brave enough to try assembly yet, so kudos to you.
Well, it's a long road yet. I might still be bailing. At the moment, it's just it's just sizing it up and seeing what that's like. And the last thing that I tried new this week, I guess this is not playing something, but it's watching people play something. There's a relatively new YouTube channel called Lowest Percent, which it talks about the speedrun category, Lowest Percent, in which they essentially, unlike the other speedruns, if you manage to finish a game with less items you are than everybody else, you automatically hold the record.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Which games are they doing for that?
There's a lot of the Legend of Zelda games are in there. Mario Sunshine, I was watching a bit on its Lowest Percent thing there. So they've managed to be able to sort of Lowest Percent for Mario Sunshine involves doing everything without Peach getting kidnapped. They kind of get as much as they can without Peach getting kidnapped, and then basically you start the cutscene that gets Peach kidnapped, and then that's the end of your run. And so whoever has the most items is the winner, and then if you have an equal amount of items you do it in the less time, then regular speedrun rules take over from then on. So it's quite interesting, and it's a fairly new development in the speedrun community, and I've been having a lot of fun checking it out.
Yeah, I always like to use a wanky word, the ludonarrative dissonance of games where, you have these narrative events, like, a princess getting kidnapped, or I think my favorite one was I think it was Batman Arkham City, or it might have been Arkham Knight, where Commissioner Gordon's daughter gets kidnapped, and the story of the game tells you, hey, you have to go save the Commissioner's daughter. But it still leaves all the side missions in the game open for you, so I think as Batman, it took me like 12 hours to get to Commissioner Gordon's daughter while I solved Joker riddles in the meantime. So yeah, I wonder if I qualify for that.
It feels a lot like that in Breath of the Wild as well. It's kind of like Zelda has been holed up for 100 years fighting Ganon, and she can probably hold on while you go visit 4 champions and maybe find some seeds and maybe level up your weapons a few times and hang out in some towns and maybe upgrade your uniform. And there's like 160 hours worth. Yeah, she's been waiting 100 years. What's 160 hours?
Yeah. That really takes away the sense of urgency from some of those. Yeah, no, I kind of wish I was a game reviewer, because it kind of feels like when we do the what are we playing segments, it's the same game for like, 3 weeks in a row, whereas you know, game reviewers, they get to play new games every week, and you don't get to do that if you've got a real job.
Yeah, and I did touch on Hades just so that I could follow along a little bit while you go through the diagnosis this episode. I didn't get to play any meaningful amount because, work and also trying to finish up my own mobile game. So I guess those things kind of get in the way sometimes.
Yeah, well, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Making games is the best game.
Yeah, I haven't finished it yet, though, and I've put in so many hours.
Well, I wonder if you can qualify for a lowest percent run on making your own game.
No, unfortunately, there are a lot of people that don't get very far there.
All right, well, should we dive into the diagnosis?
Yep, now it's time for the game design diagnosis.
Doctor, give me the news. I got a bad game that needs to improve. So how can I fix these game reviews?
So I've been playing a lot of Hades lately. How much Hades did you actually manage to get into, Dale?
I did about 3 runs.
Oh, yeah? Did you get to the next sort of biome? Or do you know sort of how many levels of Hades you managed to get through?
Just the one, by the sounds.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. No, that's, expected. I don't think you're supposed to beat the first boss until, maybe like a dozen runs into it all. But yeah, the first thing I sort of want to talk about was the storytelling in Hades, because that's the sort of thing that everyone says is the standout thing about the game.
Right, I'm starting to feel as though I haven't got enough of an opinion on this one yet.
Yeah, no, once you, start getting through the bosses, the sort of the elegance of the narrative design starts to sort of reveal itself. So there's an idea that I've had in my head for years. I think I originally sort of started mulling it over after reading I think it was even an interview with Alan Moore, or it might have just been an article about Alan Moore. But it's about the medium of stories affecting the sort of stories that can be told in it. So with Alan Moore's stories, I don't know how you feel about the movie adaptations of his graphic novels, but I think they're pretty terrible. And the reason I think that is because when he creates these stories, he's creating them for graphic novels, and he's telling stories that can only really be told as a graphic novel. So, for example, in The Watchmen, there's the chapter called Fearful Symmetry, where basically every panel in that chapter has a reflected panel, which reveals, a greater aspect of the story, and it's something you can only do in the medium of graphic novels, or in, From Hell, which is all about exploring time as the 4th dimension. And, graphic novels, they don't have a duration in the same way that movies do, so time has to be explored geometrically, and that's what he does with the graphic novel, which is something that didn't make it to the movie adaptation with Captain Jack Sparrow, that nobody ever... I don't think anyone remembers that movie. Maybe it's just me.
The Watchmen movie?
No, there was a Johnny Depp adaptation of From Hell.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, don't get me started on the Watchmen movie either.
It's kind of funny to me because I'm actually going through the audiobook version of Neil Gaiman's Sandman at the moment. And it works really well as an audio, like a radio play, basically.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting because, like, do you know if it's like a straight adaptation of the graphic novels?
Yeah, it appears to be an episode adaptation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, there's definitely, like, things that different mediums of storytelling can share with each other. Like, I mean, graphic novels sort of have the Kuleshov effect, where basically it's like the reverse shot thing where, you know, you create a sense that people like speaking to each other by having, you know, juxtaposing frames of people looking in opposite directions, and that's sort of how you know, create a sense of space and progression in a narrative. But yeah, then there's things like I was sort of talking about where, you know, like the symmetry of panels, or, you know, being able to go backwards in a graphic novel in a way that you can't while you're watching a film, that are like unique to graphic novels.
Yeah, I think also Gaiman is like kind of more open to adapting stuff as well. Like there's no one, like everyone knows that Alan Moore is kind of very much about the format and has famously taken his name off some of his adaptions because he doesn't like the idea of the adaptions. And yeah, I understand your point there. They're not the same. Yeah.
And yeah, like, I mean, I feel like this is something that games do as well, like the sort of the Naughty Dog games and, you know, like recent Rockstar games. You can sort of tell that they're very much trying to be cinematic experiences where you know, they're trying to, you know, steal the shtick from another medium, and, you know, like they work as well, because, you know, a good story is a good story, but it's, you know, a Naughty Dog game could be a movie, which sort of brings me to Hades, which is telling a story that I think you can only tell through the medium of an action roguelike. For, you know, the people that aren't sort of familiar with the concept of the game, it's an action roguelike where you're playing Zagreus, who's the Prince of Hell, who's trying to fight his way out of Hell to find his mother. But because you're a god, every time you die, you get sent back to the start. And there's, you know, the traditional sense of action roguelike repetition. But what Hades has managed to do is tie that repetition into the story, and it's a story about repetition and about, you know, the transitional sort of nature of death and that sort of, Greek mythology. So yeah, it's like I've played a lot of action roguelikes in my day. Like as I was talking to you before we started recording, like, I think it might be my favourite genre of video game. But yeah, I've never seen a game that is sort of, or an action roguelike game that sort of put storytelling at the forefront like Hades has. And, you know, when you sort of go back and look at Supergiant's body of work, it makes sense. Like, you know, the thing everyone remembers about Bastion was the narrator, and, you know, that's something that's continued on and been refined over all their games. And I think, you know, Hades is the best and most polished version of that. Yeah.
I really can't speak to the progression of the roguelike, but I did like that there were a nice couple of touches, even in the early stages, about the presentation there being a big part of the narrative of the game. Like the whole thing very early on when you die for the first time and your dad Hades is like, mate, you'll never get out of here. Nobody's ever made it out of here. You can't do that. And he's like, yeah, well, I'm just going to try. And Dad's just like, bloody teenagers always trying to escape.
Yeah. Well, do you mind if I spoil the final boss of Hades?
Let's see if we can go a little further into the breakdown before we do a spoiler blag. Is that all right? That won't ruin your discussion too much?
Oh, okay, no, I'm completely winging this.
Okay.
But yeah, like, I mean, sort of going back to the point about, you know, storytelling and, you know, storytelling unique to a medium, like, I don't know where you sort of fall on the video games as art argument.
I think video games can be art. Like, it really depends on the one. Like, you talk about the Uncharted games before, and, like, I do agree that they definitely ape a bunch of stuff from cinema, but they definitely, I think, more than try to be an Indiana Jones movie, they want to make you be Indiana Jones, which I kind of appreciate. It's like, yeah, they've got the presentation of an Indiana Jones type film, but they really nail that feeling of being the main character.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's got nothing to do with whether or not video games are art.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you consider film art, then, you know, like games are a different medium, but they're, you know, they accomplish a lot of the same things. My personal opinion is it's not terribly important. Like, I think the people arguing that games aren't art are sort of, you know, protecting the sort of snobbery of their own institutions, and I think a lot of people arguing that games are art are just sort of trying to make their dopamine hits sort of more spiritual than they necessarily are. But
Congratulations, Tom. You've alienated both sides of the argument.
yes!
Now we have no friends. You're like, fuck people who say games are or aren't art.
Yeah. No, there's one game that I'd argue is unambiguously art, and it's a Facebook Instant Games game called Runny Butt, which is an infinite runner where you play a butt. It has to jump from platform to platform. And, you know, it's an experience that sort of haunts me in my quiet moments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've always liked... I think it's hard to think that they're not art in some form. I mean, just the sheer amount of craft and art that goes into them. Like, they definitely comprise of art.
Yeah. No, like, I mean, you have to define what art is to argue whether it's art or not, and I don't think anyone can, you know, do that.
Well, art goes on walls, and that's a game on a wall right there. I pointed to a poster for those that are listening on the only way that you can consume this podcast.
Oh, well, I mean, that settles it.
Yeah, we won.
Yeah.
Games are art. Games are the most art.
Yeah, games are the most art, but, you know, they're also craft and they're also design, and, you know, I don't think it matters in the end.
No, not at all.
Yeah. No, games are valuable, and, you know, they sort of don't need to be deemed art or not art to make that matter. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. But speaking of games as design, there's a lot of really slick things that Hades does outside of the storytelling to, like, it's a very polished action RPG, especially sort of going back to, you know, Bastion, which, you know, like, it was perfectly cromulent action back in 2007 or whenever it came out. But yeah, comparing that to where Hades is now, it's a much more smooth experience. One of the things that Hades does that's just sort of like one of those invisible game design tricks that sort of makes you feel like a better player than you actually are is its very subtle auto-targeting, which I didn't notice until I got one particular upgrade on one particular weapon, which turned it off, and then all of a sudden I was missing all the enemies. Yeah, like, most of the weapons seem to have, like, quite a generous hitbox on them, but yeah, there also does seem to be some sort of auto-targeting compensation for how you turn. I think one of the reasons it manages to sort of hide it so well is because of the number of sprite directions that Hades seems to have. So I've done, like, quite a bit of work with isometric things in hobbyist projects before, and, like, the most directional sprites I've ever used for a character is 8. So if you sort of think of the world as a grid, because, you know, it's made up of tiles, there's the tile you're standing on, and then there's the all the tiles surrounding that one, so, you know, that's 8. Whereas if you start rotating your character in Hades, it seems to have far more directions than that, so there's got to be at least 16, I think. So you've got your 8, and then, you know, another 8 in between each of those possible rotations. But it could have more. Like, I haven't counted it. Which
16
I think
is a lot. Like,
yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, 8's quite a bit. You know, like, that's north, south, east, west, north, east, south, west, north, west, south, east, south, south.
Yeah, south, south.
Yeah. 16 is like south, south, south.
Yeah. South, south, southwest.
South by southwest, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, like, I really want to find out some more about the art production pipeline for that, because, like, I wonder if they did 3D renders and then sort of, like, rendered out the sprites for each of those directions, because hand drawing all of that just seems bananas to me. But yeah, because of, like, and, you know, if you go back and look at Bastion again, I think it only had 8 sprite directions, so you end up with, like, a couple of awkward movements where, you know, you're attacking an enemy which isn't, like, quite diagonal to you, and, you know, the game sort of has to compensate for it, and unless you're looking too closely, you might not even notice it. But yeah, with Hades, it's got, you know, so many of those frames, it almost feels like a 3D render. Which again, I wonder if that's what they did. If they rendered the characters in 3D or animated them all in 3D and then saved out the frames of 3D renders for a 2D sprite sheet.
Like an imposter system type thing.
Yeah, which again, like, I mean, I think the artwork's fantastic in it, but it just seems like so much work.
I often think that whenever art comes up in any of my own games.
Yeah. So yeah, another little slickness trick that I noticed was in the second biome after you beat the first boss, which is called Asphodel. The level layout changes a bit, so it goes from sort of closed rooms to little archipelagos of islands in lava. And there was a trick that I noticed, because a lot of the game's about sort of dashing around and, you know, doing, sort of quick teleporty movement, is you can teleport onto lava, but if you're fast enough, you can get back to, safe land. And that's sort of like a interesting trick of something that typically gets used in a lot of platforming games called Coyote Time. Are you familiar with Coyote Time, Dale?
Yes, I've put Coyote Time in nearly everything that I've ever made. Yep.
Yeah, and like if you play a platformer that doesn't have Coyote Time, then it feels wrong, even though in terms of physics, it's very cartoony. Yeah,
so for the listeners that don't know, and I'm sure as game design enthusiasts you've heard of this, Coyote Time is a input buffering method in which shortly after you walk off a platform, you are still able to jump for a very short amount of time. It's named after Wile E. Coyote from the Roadrunner series, as he was able to act for a short time after walking off a cliff. The inverse of that is jump buffering, which is before you land, it may accept a jump input for when you land. But yeah, Coyote Time is for a very short period after you walk off a ledge, you can jump. And if you haven't seen this before, I recommend you check it out in, say, Super Meat Boy, the relatively new platformers like the Rayman series. You'll definitely pick up on Coyote Time, kind of just giving you a little bit of help just to get over your input buffer latency, and also just to smooth over a couple of your mistakes.
Does Coyote Time go back as far as like the original Super Mario games?
No, I don't think so. There is a similar thing in effect in, say, the older platformers. I believe it's in the Sonic the Hedgehog series as well, whereas what you get is sprite overlap. So there's a thing in, say, the Sonic the Hedgehog series where you have to actually get the bounding box of your character to fully go off the edge of the cliff before you'll fall. And if you stop in that state, then Sonic actually does a losing balance animation. But that has a similar effect because essentially you can run a little bit further before you jump rather than run off before you jump. And the other one is too that it was less important during the old consoles because the instructions traveled at the speed of light and would absolutely guaranteed to be there by the next frame, whereas Bluetooth and other wireless controller inventions have meant that rather than get these 60 hertz updates, we're getting something much closer to, say, 15 hertz by the time it's gone through a Bluetooth thing. Unfortunately, input latency is the one area where computer games have not gotten better.
Yeah, well, as soon as we can solve the problem of the speed of light, then we'll truly enter a golden age of input latency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's mostly not desirable to completely solve it as well because of the whole multiplayer thing and having to relay stuff to a server and back again. So for a lot of games, particularly multiplayer games, they consider it to be a moot point.
Yeah. I think once you're getting into that level of latency requirement, then that seems to be very much like an esport type problem.
Esports, fighting games, even I saw we're going to discuss Splunky again a bit further down the list, and they had some bugs around basically input recovery in their early releases that they've since smoothed out. But yeah, there's a lot of smarts that go into input latency compensation. And Coyote Time is the one we're talking about here, and that segue should get us back on topic.
Yeah, well, let's segue all the way to Splunky.
Oh, really?
Yeah. thinking about other action roguelikes that have stolen so much of my youth and my time. You've played quite a bit of Splunky, haven't you?
Yeah, I played quite a bit, and I've been playing the sequel quite a bit lately too. Yeah, big games.
Yeah. I think I prefer Splunky to Hades, just because the way that Splunky plays, it seems to be a bit more sort of simulation driven than Hades is, where, you know, the thing that Hades manages, the thing that Hades does to overcome the, you know, repetition and the sort of banality of that, is it really is the story that you're trying to progress through each playthrough. And like, I mean, the action's slick, but each level is very similar, and they don't change, and there's not an awful lot of variation between them. You do get to a point in the game where you can sort of like fiddle with the settings before each run to make things, you know, harder or introduce new rules to the game. But yeah, it's a very sort of rote experience, whereas in Splunky, like, I think just the sort of combination of things that can appear sort of create surprising situations where, you know, you're constantly on your toes. Like, you see the same things over and over again, but they interact with each other in different ways, and that's the surprising thing that kept me going back to Splunky. And yeah, just even talking about it makes me want to go back to Splunky.
I do recommend Splunky too. It's definitely good.
Yeah. Did you ever read Derek Hughes' book on Splunky?
Yeah, I have it. I've actually only read about a third of it. Maybe I should finish it.
Yeah, like, I mean, again, Procedural Generation's like another thing that I'm interested in. I've read quite a bit about. And, like, I really liked Derek Hughes' approach to it in Splunky, where it's not as random as you might think, where each level's basically made out of, I think it's like 4x4 rooms. So they're sort of like predefined blocks, and within those blocks he's got like parts that can be, it's got random variation within those blocks as well. But when you sew them all together and then, you know, carve a guaranteed path through the level, it takes a long time before you start seeing the seams. Whereas in Hades, like, the rooms are all sort of predefined, and they're like, I mean, it's a random selection of them, but each time you go into a room, it's the same layout, and you start to recognize them pretty quickly. And then, yeah, there's just all the sort of fun things that can happen in Splunky, like, you know, you might be getting chased by a flock of spiders. I don't know what the collective noun for spiders is. And yeah, you can, you know, snatch an idol, which causes a boulder to come out and knocks them all down, and, you know, you feel very clever for coming up with that creative solution for it. Whereas Hades, it's, you know, you've got one tool, which is your weapon, and, you know, you can customize that with all the boons you get through the game. But it's yeah, it surprises me less than Splunky did.
Yeah. What about with the I'm interested, like, one of my problems with, say, especially with the first Spelunky, was that the lack of a sort of progression or a through line that, from what it sounds like, you're saying Hades kind of addresses. And Splunky 2 has an interesting way of kind of not so much addressing that, but providing you with, you know, options, which kind of make it feel a little bit different. But yeah, I was wondering what you thought about the progression of the original Spelunky versus Hades.
Yeah, like, I mean, sort of going back to, like, the original Splunky, which is, like, made in Game Maker, I think.
Oh, right, the pixel art one.
Yeah. The sort of the problem that Procedural Generation solves is content. Procedural Generation allows you to create a lot of content without having to actually, you know, tailor it yourself. The problem, well, Hades has managed to solve the problem caused by that procedural generation, which is, you know, it lacks that tailored feeling, so you sort of really have to rely on the random generation by creating a whole bunch of content to get you through that, you know, the feeling that it isn't being sort of giving you a guiding light through the game. So to summarize that mess, Hades solves the problem of, or Hades uses procedural generation to create a lot of content without having to tailor a lot of content, but then to solve the problem that causes, where you don't have, like, a guiding force through the game, it then creates a whole lot of handmade content to sprinkle through that procedurally generated content. So it's kind of like, you know, doing the work twice.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and that's probably why yeah, the random generation in Hades isn't like quite as wild as it is in Splunky, because it is a sort of more tightly polished experience.
What about in comparison to something like Binding of Isaac?
Well, I mean, Binding of Isaac sort of goes the same way as Splunky, where there's so much random variation in it, and like I think out of Splunky, Hades, and the Binding of Isaac, I've put the most hours into the Binding of Isaac. But it is very much a sort of like a gambling driven system where you know, you go through the first few levels and you hope that the items that you get give you some sort of super overpowered synergy.
Yeah,
and
you get this feeling in Binding of Isaac sometimes when you're doing well because of the things you've picked up that you haven't really earned your success.
Yeah.
And then other times you feel like, you feel robbed because it'll be the other case. You don't have enough and you should have more by this stage in the game. And you kind of like... Yeah, it very much has that gambler's kind of addiction thing going on.
Yeah, and it's the same sort of like Edmund Macmillan formula where, you know, death comes easy, but starting again's easy as well. So, you know, you get the just one more game mentality. Like, I mean, it's much more brutal than Super Meat Boy is, where, you know, if you die in Super Meat Boy, you're never like 15 seconds further away from where you were, whereas in like Binding of Isaac, if you end up dying in Sheol or one of those lower levels, then, you know, that's half an hour of your life that's just vanished into dust.
Yeah, they're nearly polar opposites in that way, because Super Meat Boy, you die in like a big complex level and your hands know how to get back to where you were. You don't even have to pay attention, whereas Binding of Isaac, you got to be alert.
Yeah. But yeah, Binding of Isaac sort of does a similar thing to Hades, where, you know, at least until you start, you know, maxing out all your item paths, like, you get rewarded with unlocks in between runs that, you know, make the next run that little bit easier, or potentially a little bit easier depending on RNG. And that's something that Hades does as well, but it's also allows you to do permanent upgrades, which you're sort of guaranteed to get each subsequent run. So you're always getting a feeling of progression from run to run, which sort of makes it most similar to, like, Dead Cells is probably the closest game in recent years that I've also sunk a lot of time into. But yeah, like, I feel like Hades and Dead Cells sort of belong to one school of action RPGs, which is about, you know, sort of very tightly polished action and, you know, also more authored content. Like Dead Cells is another game where you start seeing the repetition in the generation fairly quickly. Whereas, yeah, Splunky and Binding of Isaac live in a very chaotic world where, you know, a lot of the game's based in luck. And, you know, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing either. Like, luck is just, you know, a part of games and how, you know, humans play. Like, you know, I think we mentioned it on the last episode or the episode before that, sort of just, you know, how early humans started gambling. So there's something in our brains that finds that inherently compelling. And,
I'll
you know,
bet you $20 there isn't.
You're on. I'm so glad that I don't play the pokies or go to casinos or anything, because, like, that's, like, I just know there's something in my brain that would, you know, latch onto that, and that seems like a real good way to destroy my life. So I sink that energy into action roguelikes instead.
Yeah, right. So did you want to go into the spoiler-heavy territory there, or do you think...
To be honest, like, I don't think there's much to say. Like, I think, well, other than just sort of how it complements the storytelling and also solving that problem of repetition in roguelikes. So, you know, I'll leave that a mystery for the listeners to find out for themselves.
As one of them, I appreciate that.
All right.
So that's cool. That was a good look into Hades. I'm actually kind of looking forward to playing it a little bit more now. Like I said, I've only really put in maybe half an hour's worth of play, maybe 3 runs, if that. And I couldn't really see the appeal based on that. But, you know, also, just a note here. Because I just have a quick note. Presentation-wise, there is very little chance I would have picked this game up if it hadn't have gotten the the accolades that it did, based on old mate box art just looking like he's Sephiroth or some rejected Square Enix villain. I understand that that's not the case, and that when you get into the game it looks pretty decent. Having said that, I haven't blown it up any larger than a Switch screen at this stage, but I often find some of that stuff where it's got just a little bit of that grimdark and then mixed in with a little bit of some kind of comic booky anime thing, like Darksiders. That it just it always feels a little bit weird because they're always like, check out how sinister I am, kid.
See, I was getting more like dating simulator vibes from it.
Yeah, well, that's the other vibe.
Oh, what was that? There's like another action game where you like date your swords. Was it called Dungeon Daddy? Or am I mixing up? Yeah.
I know. Yeah. I think the other one that was kind of interesting to me, because I am playing a models at the moment, is just hearing the names of all the characters that I've been interacting with coming back into Hades, and I'm just like, I've got all these preconceived notions of who these people are based on a completely different game. Just funny that Greek mythology has cropped up twice there.
Oh yeah, it's such a easy thing to steal from for writers. All right, well, how about we move on to our next segment, which is I give you a design challenge to design a game for next week.
All right, it's the design challenge intro part, and it sounds like a design challenge.
It's a design challenge.
If you find a better design, we'll beat it by 10%. Lowest prices are just the beginning. I don't know what. Yeah, we'll put something better there. Design challenge.
It's a design challenge.
If you find a better design, we'll beat it by 10%. Lowest prices are just the beginning.
Yeah, so I thought we'd stick with our theme of Greek mythology, so Dale, for next week. I'd like you to design me a game based around Greek mythology and Greek gods. I want it to have some sort of aspect of court intrigue to it.
Right. Interesting, yes.
And finally, it needs to have some sort of random mechanic in it, but you can't use dice
To determine the random mechanic.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So am I doing this as a tabletop design?
That's up to you. I think it makes sense as a tabletop design, and I think that's probably radio friendly.
Or card. I could probably do card.
Or card. Feel free to surprise me. Those are the parameters, but what you do with those are up to you.
So Greek mythology, court intrigue, and some kind of random mechanic that isn't determined by dice.
Yep.
Huh. I'm starting to think like maybe a clock on the wall is used as the as the determinant. If you're in the fourth quadrant when this is read out, then you get this outcome. It could actually be. I think there might be something to this. Like maybe I'll make it a sundial, and you have to play in the sun because of the Greek mythology.
Oh, that's sort of the indie tabletop wank that they'll eat up on itch.io.
Wait, they do tabletop games on itch.io?
Oh yeah, that's like the place for publishing like RPG zines and stuff.
Oh, right. I just thought Kickstarter was where most of that was happening at the moment.
No, Kickstarter's where you go after you've made it on itch.io.
Yeah.
That's the big leagues.
Yeah, you only really ever kickstart your advertising campaign these days.
Yeah, exactly.
Funny stuff. All right, cool. So that design challenge is going to be next week. Thanks, Tom, for your diagnosis on Hades. I guess it's my turn to do the diagnosis next.
Yeah. Do you know what you're going to play yet?
I don't really, but I have been meaning to play A Short Hike, and apparently that's got some interesting things to it, so maybe that could be a fun game while I still march towards App Store launch.
Yeah, well, good luck with that.
Yeah, I've heard good things, so I can't wait to play that one. All right, well, I guess that wraps up this week's episode. Until next week, I've been... Oh, wait, we don't do this every week, do we?
No, next episode.
All right, I guess that wraps up this episode of the Game Design Hacks. Thanks for joining us. Until next episode, I've been Dale.
And I've been Tom.
Say your catchphrase.
I've got a catchphrase?
Yeah, that's what you do now. You have a catchphrase.
And that's games.
And that's games. Goodbye.